The Tale of the Tiny Fairy, written by Akito and Yukiko Watanabe, translated by Catherine Collins. The tiny fairy is very small. So small, she wears a hat of baby's breath. On full moon nights, she dances in fields of baby's breath. Energy from the moon makes her wings crisp and allows her to fly far. When the tiny fairy flies, she leaves behind a little light dust, which becomes a track of light in the sky. The tiny fairy's father is an earth fairy. The tiny fairy's mother is a wind fairy. So the tiny fairy can fly. And she is also friends with the animals, plants, and bugs who live on the earth and in the earth. The tiny fairy is a flower fairy, so she takes care of the flowers. However, when there are lost seeds, or she doesn't know what to do, she asks her mother and father for help. The tiny fairy is very busy in the spring. Many flowers bloom at this time, and she has to take care of them. Today, this flower field. Tomorrow, that cherry blossom tree. The tiny fairy always wears a baby's breath hat, but during this season, each flower gives her a petal, which she uses to weave a hat. The tiny fairy is very fashionable in her hat woven from many different flower petals. Her friends and neighbors can look at her hat and see what flower fields she visited that day. When the flowers see her hat, they think, "I want to bloom even more beautifully," and they try harder. In the spring, the bugs wake up and become lively. They all play tag together. The honeybees fly quickly, so they are good at turning and can catch their friends easily. When tag is over, everyone enjoys a special honey drink. During the rainy season, the tiny fairy arranges the color scheme and balance of the hydrangeas. She tells the snails which leaves are fresh and which leaves are thick and good for taking a walk with their children. When summer comes, the fireflies come out. The tiny fairy polishes them, so their lights will sparkle and shine beautifully. Once they're polished and shining, the fireflies set off to find a bride. When summer comes, the tiny fairy polishes the hard outer wings of the beetles. Using cloth made of dandelion thread she collected in the spring, the tiny fairy wipes the water from the insects without hard outer wings like the cicada and dragonfly, making their wings crisp. As summer comes to an end, it starts getting cooler, and the tiny fairy thinks soon it will be fall. During this time, the flowers that bloom and the insects that sing in the fall start their preparations. The cosmos flowers give the tiny fairy their pink petals for her winter coat. The insects collect fallen leaves for the fall so she can make her house warm. In the depth of fall, the trees of the forest become red and yellow. The tiny fairy flutters amongst the falling red and yellow leaves as she strolls in the forest. The falling leaves come in many shapes, so the way they fall are all different. The ginkgo leaves go sailing down flip-flop. The red maple leaves glide down swish-swash. And the pine cones fall with a plop, surprising the tiny fairy. Winter time is getting closer, so the tiny fairy takes care of the animals who hibernate. She collects lots of chestnuts for the squirrel's burrow and makes preparations for the bugs that spend winter beneath the falling leaves by making the earth nice and warm. On cold winter mornings, the tiny fairy wakes early and dresses warmly in fallen leaves and basket-warm silk before she sets out. On winter mornings, the forest floor is covered in crystals of frost. The tiny fairy is very tiny indeed, so even if she steps on the frost crystals, they don't collapse. She likes to climb the frost crystals. They are very crunchy. Then the sun comes out, and little by little, the frost melts away. The tiny fairy likes to take walks in the forest in winter. As she walks in the forest, the flickering snowflakes alight on the ground. The snowflakes dance as they fall in the forest and gradually cover everything in white. After the tiny fairy dances with the snowflakes for a while, she walks home through the forest and city and fields that are blanketed in white. The tiny fairy is very busy preparing for spring in the winter, but sometimes she has a day off. On those days, she goes to meet her friends. For example, she will visit Honeybee's house. In the winter, honeybees don't go outside, so they spend time in the hive. In the hive, the tiny fairy drinks tea and eats honey cakes. They exchange information about what flowers have been planted And what kind of honey can be made if the honeybees go to the fields? Thanks to the tiny fairy, the honeybees can gather lots of honey, and they are very grateful. Because of this, honey will never run short at the tiny fairy's house. This is where our tale of the tiny fairy ends. But she'll be hard at work tomorrow too.